Imagine a world where knights, the most revered warriors of their time, had become nothing more than pampered, lazy, and self-indulgent nobles. This was the shocking reality of the late 14th century, a time when the ideals of chivalry were crumbling, and the once glorious knights were seen as more of a burden than a blessing. This essay will take you on a journey through this turbulent period, exploring the decline of chivalry, the moral failures of the nobility, and the political upheavals that shook France and England. In the 1380s, the nobles of Europe had become a far cry from the brave and honorable knights of old. They lounged in their luxurious private bedrooms, sleeping until noon, and indulged in soft beds, perfumed baths, and every comfort they could imagine. Jean Gerson, the chancellor of the university, sarcastically remarked that the ancient Romans would never have burdened themselves with such frivolous luxuries on the battlefield. The nobles of his time, he suggested, had become soft and decadent, more interested in their own comfort than in the chivalric values of bravery, honor, and service. The moral failure of chivalry was even more disheartening. Troubadours, who once sang of the ideal knight and his noble deeds, were replaced by moralists who satirized the knight's vices and follies. Knights were no longer seen as champions of justice, but as predators and aggressors. The chansons digests, epic poems that celebrated the heroic deeds of knights, fell out of favor, and the fablioques, bawdy tales that mocked the nobility, disappeared as well. The literary spirit seemed to have failed, but the real issue was the deteriorating state of chivalry. In Italy, the complaint about the decline of knighthood took a different form. Franco Sacchetti, a writer and poet, lamented that bakers, wool carters, usurers, money changers, and other commoners had become knights. He questioned the need for officials to have knighthood when they presided over provincial towns. Sacchetti's tone was morose, and he asked, "Why has this once noble dignity sunk so low? What knightly duty do these new knights fulfill?" His words echoed a widespread sentiment that knighthood was dead. The situation was dire in France, where the royal court was ruled by minors and plagued by factions. The young King Charles VI was surrounded by uncles who were more interested in their own power than in the welfare of the kingdom. The new Emperor Wenceslas was a drunkard and a brute, and the church was split between two popes, each as corrupt as the other. Despite the glittering facade of the ruling class, the underlying problems were impossible to ignore. One of the key figures in this period was Enguerrand, and the seventh Lord of Coucy, a powerful noble who recognized the diminishing prestige of knighthood. He suggested reforms, but his ideas often made matters worse. The Guelders campaign of 1388 is a perfect example of how military expeditions had become a farce. The campaign was launched on a scale that was out of all proportion to its petty goals. The army, led by Coucy, had to march through the dark and forbidding Ardennes forest, a task that required cutting a new road through the wilderness. The cost of the expedition was so high that a triple tax on salt and sails was imposed, a burden that was difficult to justify. The campaign itself was a disaster. Little combat was found, and negotiations dragged on. The tents were wet from heavy rains, provisions rotted, and food was scarce. The return journey was even worse, with heavy rains turning the roads into mud, horses stumbling over slippery logs and rocks, and men drowning in flooded rivers. The knights, squires, and grand seigneurs returned without pride or profit, many of them sick or exhausted. The blame fell on the Duke of Burgundy, whose ambitions in Brabant had led to the campaign. The moral decay of the nobility was not lost on the chroniclers of the time. The monk of St. Denis reported that a hermit had traveled from Provence to warn the king and his uncles to treat their subjects more gently and reduce taxes. The nobles at court scorned the hermit and ignored his counsel, but the young king was more sympathetic. Despite his kindness, the uncles levied the triple tax, further alienating the people. The poet Eustache Deschamps, who participated in the Guelders campaign and fell ill with dysentery, became increasingly critical of the knights. In his ballads, he compared the knights of the past, who were hardy and well-trained, to the soft and indolent young men of his time. The knights of the past had gained their strength through long apprenticeships, practicing skills like wrestling, scaling forts, and combat with shield and sword. The younger knights, in contrast, scorned training and spent their time eating, drinking, borrowing, and polishing themselves to look like paladins. They were arrogant, irreligious, and unfit for the profession of arms. Deschamps also criticized the knights for their recklessness and lack of judgment. In his Lay de Valence, he described how they kept no order, no night watch and no scouts. They failed to protect foragers, allowed carts and provisions to be captured, and complained loudly when in trouble. Their recklessness and lack of preparation made their armies easy targets for defeat. Despite his harsh words, Deschamps did not advocate for fundamental change or the infusion of new blood into the nobility. He was sympathetic to the bourgeoisie and deplored injustice to the peasants, but he opposed peasants who tried to become squires and leave their labor on the land. He believed that such rogues should be brought to justice and kept in their place. The moral corruption of society was also a central theme in the works of Philippe de Mézières, a writer and diplomat. His Dream of the Old Pilgrim was an allegorical guidebook that criticized the state of the world and called for the reformation of all of Christianity, especially the Kingdom of France. Mézières' message was urgent, his sense of wrongdoing profound, and his prognosis somber. He saw a world in need of redemption, where the Queen of Truth and her attendants peace, mercy, and justice had long been absent. In 1388, King Charles VI, at the age of 20, dismissed his uncles and assumed full sovereignty. This decision was a response to the growing unpopularity of the dukes, and the need to lift the burden of their unpopularity from the crown. The Cardinal of Leon proposed the motion at a meeting of the council, and a few days later, he died, widely believed to have been poisoned by the uncles. The Duke of Clisson later boasted that he had been instrumental in Charles VI's rise to power, but the real force behind the change was Charles' younger brother, Louis, Duc de Touraine, who became known as the Duc d'Orléans. Louis of Orleans was a complex figure. He was a handsome pleasure-seeker and a devoted servant of Venus, known for his love of dancing, flattery, and loose living. He was also deeply religious and often retreated to the Celestine monastery for days at a time. He was a scholar for his station, known for his ability to understand diplomatic Latin, and a compulsive gambler who played chess, tennis, dice, and cards, often losing large sums of money. Louis was as ambitious and power-hungry as the uncles he replaced. His feud with the Duke of Burgundy would end in his murder 19 years later, tearing France and Burgundy apart and reopening the way for the English. Despite his indulgences, Louis saw his world somberly. He adopted a device that represented the clerical hood or knight's mantle, symbolizing the evil and malice of his time. Coucy, despite his association with the ousting of the dukes, continued to entertain Philip the Bold and his son, the Count of Nevers. The duke's accounts show that he and his son dined and slept at Coucy's castle, and presented gifts to Coucy's wife and daughter. Coucy was always worth cultivating, and his influence remained significant. The reorganized council made a serious effort to end the duke's personal autocracy and restore the administrative system of Charles V. The marmosets Rivière, Mercier, and others regained authority, and the bureaucracy was purged of the uncle's men. 5 commissioners of reform were appointed to address the worst abuses, remove corrupt officials, and replace them with good men. Measures were taken to improve sewage collection and restrict professional beggars, whose grotesque appearances were stripped away each night in the Cour des Miracles. The central problem of financing the government was recognized, and a series of ordinances were implemented to address financial and judicial reforms. However, the cancellation of the university's tax exemption, attempted by Rivière and Mercier, earned them the powerful enmity of the university, adding to the opposition from the dukes. While France was grappling with these issues, England was experiencing a more lethal drama. The central figure was Robert de Vere, the 9th Earl of Oxford and the husband of Philippa de Coucy. Oxford was King Richard II's closest advisor and friend, having been brought to court as a boy through his marriage to Philippa. He had a dominant influence over the young king, who was 5 years his junior and fatherless. Oxford managed the king as he pleased, and his influence shaped a willful and capricious sovereign. King Richard at 21 was slender, yellow-haired, and pale-faced, with a skin that flushed easily. He was oversplendid in his dress, averse to war, and ill-tempered with his domestics. His Plantagenet pride, combined with Oxford's influence, led to the levying of extortionate taxes to pay for his luxuries. Before his downfall, which would spell the end of the Plantagenets, Richard is credited with inventing the handkerchief, recorded in his household rolls as little pieces of cloth made for giving to the Lord King for carrying in his hand to wipe and clean his nose. Oxford's rise to power was rapid and unchecked. Richard made him a Knight of the Garter, and at 21, a member of the Privy Council. He showered Oxford with lands, castles, wardships, lordships, and revenues, including a hereditary sheriffdom belonging to the Buckingham family. This was a dangerous move, and it only served to further alienate the opposition, led by the ruthless Duke of Gloucester, who despised Oxford for his reluctance to pursue the war. The Duke of Gloucester, now a powerful figure, became the focus of the oppositionist party, which sought to curb the power of the king's favorite. The stage was set for a dramatic confrontation that would have far-reaching consequences for England and the Plantagenet dynasty. In both France and England, the decline of chivalry, the moral decay of the nobility, and the political upheavals of the late 14th century marked a turning point in European history. The once glorious knights had become a symbol of decadence and self-indulgence, and the ideals of chivalry were all but forgotten. The young kings of France and England, influenced by their favorites and surrounded by power-hungry uncles, struggled to maintain their authority and bring order to their kingdoms. The challenges they faced were immense, and the consequences of their actions would shape the future of Europe for generations to come.